the borage family are very nectar rich, and when a bee visits a flower, they immediately replenish the nectar, and they're one of the few plant families that are able to do that. And usually they have blue flowers. They open pink, they get pollinated, they go blue. I went to John Mass's many years ago, because I've known John for 30 years. He said that he bought the nursery off an old lady who used to dry her washing in the greenhouse. And he was scandalised. And I was living in Hook Norton at the time, and guess what? My washing was in the greenhouse.
Hello and welcome to Talking Dirty, one of our specials focusing on the seasonal treats at East Ruston Old Vicarage, this time looking at all the wonders of March. Over at East Ruston Old Vicarage, we have Alan Edward Herbert Gray, our happy and very handsome horticulturalist. How are you? How is your garden?
Well, I'm recovering from a cold, but that's neither here nor there. The garden is absolutely fantastic. At this time of the year, it's absolutely full of optimism, as you should know, sitting over there in Cambridgeshire, in your lovely stripy oranges and yellows and pinks with is it a boiler suit you've got on? Dungarees. Did you know dungarees is an Indian word?
It like bungalow.
Probably did. Yeah, it's like bungalow and bantam.
We do love a tangent on this podcast.
Enough of this rubbish. Yes, the garden's looking absolutely fantastic. I was looking out the bedroom window this morning, and for a change, it's sunny here. We haven't had the sun for a long, long time. We've had copious amounts of rain, and water is lying in fields and things everywhere around the county. It's really been quite bad. But this morning the sun is shining, and I looked out of my bedroom window, and there, right in front of me, was Magnolia Caerhays Belle. It's a kind of flamingo pink, I suppose. It's not this bright, shocking pink, but it's a kind of flamingo pink, and it's very, very early. And Caerhays Belle is known for being early. And Graham and I bought this particular grafted tree from Caerhays Castle many, many years ago, and it starts flowering because they're grafted. I mean, normally it's a Campbellii hybrid, I should say that, or a hybrid of Campbellii. And Campbelliis can, if you buy a seedling tree, it can take 50 years to flower. It might not, but it might take 50 years. But if you buy a grafted version of it, it will flower within 5 years, which is what we did. And it was very expensive. I suppose probably it doesn't sound so much today, but it's £60. And I think 60 or £65, probably 30 years ago, you would have thought twice about it, shall we say. Anyway, it flowers regularly very early, but this year the season is kind of topsy-turvy. I mean, everybody was having snowdrops out at Christmas time, whether it's the regular varieties like, Three Ships or something like that, or not, doesn't matter. But I mean, everything is early. And I looked out of the other side of the bedroom window, and there across in the woodland gardens, a white magnolia flowering away. Now, that's not happened before this early. Now, the great danger of that is, of course, that we're still in, well, I suppose meteorologically we're in spring, but it doesn't really quite feel like that yet. It's getting there. But, when you have cold, frosty nights, the problem is that those fresh blossoms can get browned, and then they look miserable, like dirty old handkerchiefs hanging on the tree. So we hope we're not going to have too much in the way of frost.
I don't have a lot of magnolia in my garden. I have one little baby genie who unfortunately lives in a pot because I really want to plant my genie in my next garden. Beautiful, dark, really rich, dark purple flowers. And I do love the dark flowered magnolias. I suppose we all covet the beautiful pale flowered ones, the whites and the pinks. And certainly thanks to, I don't know, when I was younger, did garden centres really push magnolias, or did everyone just have magnolia envy? Because so many sort of suburban gardens seem to have them. Where I live, there are loads of phenomenal magnolias that have clearly been in for 30, 40 years.
Probably Magnolia soulangeana, which is the one that everybody planted, I think. And I mean that was the magnolia that you saw in a garden centre or a nursery. But I mean, over the years, there's been numerous introductions. Some of them have been bred in New Zealand by Jury, Jury, who's been breeding camellias as well. And so I think that, everybody, all the Magnolia cognoscenti, if you like, they've got together and they've, said, come on, we can have more interesting ones than just soulangeana. And I would counsel anybody today, if you could only buy one magnolia, I would say try and be a bit patient and buy a variety that flowers probably in March and April, because there's less chance of its flowers being ruined by frost. I mean, if you've got a big enough garden like I have, you can have the early ones. And if you lose the blossom for a couple of years, well, you lose it, but you have others to follow. But if you don't have the space to have more than one, I would go for a later flowering one, actually.
Yeah, it'll never happen, but I do live in hopes that we'll buy a house at some point that has some glorious mature magnolia in the garden. Of course, an impossibility.
You know what will happen, though, don't you? It'll be in completely the wrong place.
Well, obviously, yeah. There's a glorious garden just up the road from me, and I never ever see the people who garden it. I just live in hope. I'm out walking the dog, I'm out with the baby, and I go past and I think, will I see the person responsible? I never see them, and yet they have this wonderful magnolia underplanted with a carpet of cyclamen and narcissus and scillas and all these lovely things. And they're clearly very talented, and they've put together this patchwork.
They're probably going to be the kind of people that say to you, well, we don't do anything to it.
Yeah. Well, they clearly don't do all that much unless they garden exclusively under the cover of darkness, because I go past a lot and I never see them. Yeah, they're out there. They're nocturnal gardeners, maybe. But it's a real inspiration to me. I would love to have that kind of sort of kind of.
Well, I mean, I was talking about looking out the bedroom window, but I mean, and it's not really spring yet, but it is getting there, because if you look across the treetops and things, I'm 3 stories up. So if you look across the treetops and things, there's this gentle haze it's like a fuzz of green just appearing. And you get that sort of purple fuzz that you get on birch trees and things. And it is absolutely lovely. I'll tell you, of interest, I know you talked about going off at tangents, but when I drove down to have lunch with you in Cambridgeshire the other day, I did notice there were quite a number of pine trees when you drive across Thetford Chase and that area that died. Oh. And I'm thinking that it's probably, the cause was probably the drought of 2022. And they've only just sort of started to die. And the ones that I could see were obviously on the outside of the forested areas, or, going across a field, sort of what would have been a hedge, I suppose, or the remains of a plantation or something. There were quite a few that had died. And then I got home and I was driving past Sprowston Manor, which you know quite well. And they have some rather nice weeping brewer's spruce. There's a stand of about 5 of them, and 3 of those are dead. And I just think trees take longer to die than, herbaceous perennials and other smaller plants. So probably we're still sort of seeing those casualties.
It is good being a gardener when you travel, because there's so much more to see. I always wonder, what do people look at when they are not interested in plants? Walking, driving, you're always, obviously, particularly if you're the driver, looking at the road.
Well, they're like us as children, we used to count cows.
I remember that one when I'm trying to entertain Fiola when he's older.
Exactly.
Now, your garden, I'm imagining, as spring is springing everywhere, is absolutely resplendent with all the treasures, not just magnolias, but all kinds of lovely things. What's been catching your eye?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily what's been catching my eye, it's what we've been doing. Because, I always try not to do too much work in the spring. And I always resolutely fail. I mean, it's dreadful. But Ian said to me a few weeks ago, we were walking around the garden looking at various jobs that needed doing. And he said the box hedge in the old wall garden, which is directly outside the office window where I am today, he said is looking pretty disgusting now. The blight has got so bad. There's more blight and less box than the other way around. And I do think it's time to bite the bullet and take it out. And this morning, that is what we're doing. So we're replacing all the box hedging in the old wall garden, and we're replacing it with yew. And I mean, there are some people that say it will be successful, and some people that say that it won't. Who knows? I don't know. But I know that I've had box hedging in the garden for at least 15 years in the 2 beds at the top of the library steps. which had box, and that box blight got so bad we put you in about 10 to 15 years ago, something like that. And they're perfectly all right. And it's made a nice, sharp, neat, but dark hedge. Alternatives to box, I mean, there are many, and many choices. And people are now, various reporters and gardening journalists are now coming up with ideas of what to use. And I had a conversation some time ago with Matt Potter when I said to him, people shouldn't look at it as an alternative to box. They should look at whatever they're using as a hedge in its own right. Because if you compare box to anything else, nothing quite matches the crispness, the sharpness, the colour, everything about box is wonderful, except for box caterpillar and box blight. And, you know, really and truthfully, I'm only doing what good garden practitioners did years ago and to this day. Antirrhinum rust, for instance, if you've got antirrhinum rust in your garden, you didn't grow antirrhinums at all for 3 to 5 years. And then you hoped after that period of time that the fungus that attacks the antirrhinums had petered out. And the same with downy mildew on Nicotianas, for instance. That's something that happens periodically. Whether it's caused by weather or what it is, I don't know. Or whether it's the fungal spores sort of, you know, multiplying sufficiently enough to move around. Or could it be visitors to my garden? I mean, who knows? It could be, couldn't it?
Yeah.
They've only got to have spores on their clothes and, you know.
So your box replacement with your what size plants are you putting in? What's your spacing? Are these all things that have sort of been pre-worked out?
Yes, I mean, our spacing is something between 45 and 60 meters, 60 centimeters, I suppose. And so that's 18 inches to 2 feet, if you like, depending on the size of the plants. The plants that I've got are about 30 centimeters tall. They're bare root. And I asked my friend Richard from Lincolnshire, who's a wholesale grower, if he'd get me them, and he delivered them on Wednesday this week. And so that's why we're getting on with it quickly, because they are bare root and I don't want them to be out of the ground too long. And so we've drafted in a few extra help. We've got some volunteers today, and I think we've got about 6 people, you know, 2 digging out, 2 carting away, 2 planting, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit like a production line out there. I mean, it really is. It's quite exciting to think about it in a way.
Yeah.
But of course, we're going to have to watch these plants for the first year or two to make sure that they don't dry out and die, because, you know, they're going to need irrigating. And I'm afraid it's going to be irrigating by hand. So we're going to be dragging hose pipes around for the next couple of years.
Well, you know what's going to happen now. We have had so much rain. The moment you plant a hedge, it's going to go dry.
Well, if it does, we'll put some leaky pipe down, I think, because that would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, the yew that you have in the sunk garden, you put that right back, didn't you? You know, you had these big sort of yew. They're not quite pillars, but these sort of nice hedges, and
they were cones. They were cones.
Oh, they were cones. There we go. They were cones, and you cut them right back to the stump, basically. You know, the trunk.
The skeletal trunk, yeah. Well, gardeners will advise you to if you're shortening a yew hedge, for instance, or you're making it thinner, you cut one side and leave it for 2 years, and then you cut the other sides, so that the first side you cut has time to regenerate. How do you cut one side off a cone? You can't. So I decided last year that we would cut them hard back to the bare trunks, because what had happened is that over time the cones had got corpulent, a bit like Henry VIII, I'm afraid. That their waistlines were expanding rather too much, and so we decided that we would cut them hard back. And you know, there was a few gruff old gentlemen visiting the garden. What have you done to that? Do you think that's got to grow again? And my retort was, well, do you think I'd have done it if I didn't? But to be quite honest, I mean, I didn't know whether they would regenerate as well as I didn't expect them to regenerate as well as they have in actual fact. And so this year we're now going back, and having had a year's growth. We put them on drip watering system last year as well. Having had a year now to sort of put some formative growth out, we're going to have to shape them. And I want them to be much slimmer. So I want them to be slim upright, smart cones rather than corpulent gentlemen.
Slim and trim.
Yes, lemon trim, that's the way.
So you've been doing some major revamping with your hedges and also the holly field.
Well, the Hollyfield had been somewhat rather neglected for a few years. We have a bit of disease on some of the hollies in there, and we're having to deal with that. Don't quite know what we're going to do with that yet. Some of the hollies we've taken out, we'll see whether. I mean, it's interesting because these fungal diseases, they will attack some hollies, and other hollies they will not touch at all. Now, why should that be? I don't know. But the Hollyfield had become a little bit overgrown. And also the surrounding trees, which were shelter belts, had become rather tall, as they do. And of course, it had got rather dark and damp in there. And that might be part of the reason the hollies have got this disease. And so we've been thinning that out. And we've also got rid of the grass. So the grass is not there because it was a series of island beds in grass. And the grass is impossible to keep it looking nice. It's always damp, as I just said. And so we decided to incorporate that into the adjacent woodland. Now there's a hedge and a fence between the woodland and the Hollyfield, but because the trees have grown up so much, the hedge is largely dead or dying, and the fence is a rickety old thing now. And so we're gradually getting rid of that and merging the two, hence covering the surface of the Hollyfield with this bark mulch that we have from the trees that we've had cut down. And we save all of that, and then we use that as a path topping, if you like, and that works really, really well. So it's a bit like recycling and things going on there, but it is quite exciting when you go in and you clear things out, because you suddenly get to the stage where I didn't know that was there, and you discover a plant that's grown really quite well, and it needs clearing around it now to give emphasis to it rather than just be part of an amorphous mass. So yeah, I've been enjoying that actually, in actual fact. And if you get 3 or 4 of you working in there together and you go away to do something else and you come back and you suddenly think, my God, well, look at this, I've got space. And similarly, we had a path leading down to the potager, the vegetable potager. And there were some holly trees on the right hand side, and they gradually come over and over and over until everything was growing like that to get out of the way, get to the light. And so we cut those down and we've opened it up, and I was rather loath to do it because there's a service path behind, and it's a path where you go on towards the bonfire and the compost heaps and all of those things. So it's a heavily used path, and I thought it might look rather ugly. And then I suddenly thought to myself, well, no, don't be silly, because this is all because we open the garden regularly to visitors 5 days a week. And I thought, people like to see behind the scenes. So they can't get there because there's a whopping great border in the way, but they can see it and they can see what's happening. And they can see the way for instance, I've planted a rose. There's one seedling rose that has the most beautiful new foliage, it's a kind of red on the backs of the leaves and it's glaucous above. So you've got these lovely grey and red foliage. It hasn't flowered yet. It's a seedling, a self-sown seedling from some of the other roses in the garden, but it's obviously very vigorous because it's twining its way up into the oak tree. And I hope we'll get flowers this year and see just what it produces. It will probably be, I should think, 99% of them, as 99% of them are, a white flowered variety. It would be a white flowered hybrid of some sort. From, I don't know, Rambling Rector or one of those sort of type of filipes, Kiftsgate, the big jobbies. Anyway, the other one I planted there is a double white one. I'm searching for the name of it at the moment. Madame Alfred Carrière. There you are. Madame Alfred Carrière, because she's quite a vigorous rose, and I've never succeeded in pruning it correctly. And I don't know whether I'm too impatient or quite what it is, but I think that if you can plant it into a tree and you just let it do its own thing, it will oblige you and it will do, really well. So people can see where those roses are. One is a self-sown seedling. They can see how we've swung it away up into the trees, and where we've planted the other one, we put it away from the tree trunk, obviously, and you prepare a lovely big planting hole, put lots of good food in it, some well-rotted manure and a top dressing of bloodfish and bone meal when you finish, and don't forget to water it well, and then plant it, I suppose, at least a metre, if not more, away from the trunk, because otherwise the roots from the oak tree are going to be taking all the goodness out of where your rose is growing, and then you train your branches and towards the tree. And it takes, I suppose, if I'm optimistic, it takes 6 years, and if I'm not optimistic, it takes 10 years before you get a climbing rose or a rambling rose going up into a tree and then billowing out with these great clouds of blossom. But it's so satisfying to do, and I shall continue doing that for the rest of my life, because whether I see them or not doesn't matter. What matters is that somebody will.
Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, I don't have big trees to train things up into. Maybe in the future I will, but roses at this time of year, we're quite often down on rose foliage. It's not like they're the most beautiful plants later in the year. But I've got, what is he, Shropshire Lad across my back fence, which has actually had some lovely hips this year. So that's been a nice sight from my kitchen window. And now all the fresh new foliage is coming through, and it's very red, and it's really been like catching the light.
Yeah.
Don't get a lot of light in my garden at this time of year. It's north facing and it's quite small, and the garage shades it. So anything that can just pick up a bit of light and sort of glow with a bit of luster is really, very welcome in my garden. So here for rose foliage in spring. And I'm so...
Well, it's worth considering.
Yeah, I'm so sort of sad that I haven't seen your garden at this time of year, because despite the fact that we associate East Ruston with brugmansias and exotics, later in the season maybe, I just love going for a walk in your garden at this time of year, your woodlandy areas, your slightly shadier areas, and seeing all of those primulas coming through and all the new growth and all these little, there are so many exciting treasures that you can spy.
Well, I'm rather thrilled this year because, common or garden, call them whatever you like, however you like to use the terminology you use about them, but violets, sweet violets. I've been collecting sweet violets for years, and because you've had some of them. But this time of the year, I normally, they're just nibbled away by muntjac. This year they've been spared, and we've got lovely patches of white violets and pink violets and long stem purple violets. They are looking really, really good. And it's something that I think that I would like to do in the future is it's a silly little personal thing, but I'd just like to have a patch of violets, as my grandmother did, underneath the cloche. So, and her cloche was a wooden box with a bottom knocked out and a piece of glass put on the top. But that's all it needs to give a little bit of protection to a clump of violets to bring them forward by 3 or 4 weeks. And I'm sure this is what people did when they grew violets for cutting years ago. They used to cut and sell the bunches for a penny each or something ridiculous. But I just think it would be so nice so that you could. The trouble is, of course, then I'd be like Val Bourne. I'd say, I've grown these to cut for the house, but I can't bear to cut them. But it'd be nice just to have them a little bit earlier. And I've got 1 or 2 old-fashioned cloches, which would be nice because it'd give a use for them as well, wouldn't it?
It's so true what Val said when she was on the podcast about, most recently on the podcast, about the great thing about something like dahlias, where you want to cut them because you want more of them. I do still struggle even with dahlias, because when I walk onto the allotment, something like Hollyhill Serenity, which was more yellow than I was expecting, but it was just like this big beacon, really, as you'd walk in, this big golden beacon. And so I didn't really want to cut too much because I wanted it to sit there looking all happy on the patch. But so even I struggle to cut even dahlias, but at least something like dahlias, that you're doing them a favor, if you like, and you're encouraging more bloom.
Exactly.
One of the great things about dahlias, but we can't talk about those now because we've got more things to talk about. Flowers of the season. Narcissus. I always associate your garden with lots of lovely narcissi. Oh,
snap!
Here's a sort of secret. So we had a lot of connection problems with this podcast, which I was almost grateful for, because Daddy and baby and dog are all out of the house, and so I just sat here with my coffee and my Scamps catalogue while I waited for Alan's connection to be successful. Thank you very much to Matt behind the scenes who made it successful. And I've just been looking through my Scamps catalogue and coveting and building up a wish list. It's been really lovely.
Well, I think, you see, You see, this is something that, I mean, they're very clever at Scamps. They send out a list, which is this catalogue here. And it covers all the daffodils, trumpet daffodils, but and narcissi. Well, they're all technically narcissi, of course, but the choice is absolutely phenomenal. And if you want to grow daffodils or narcissi in pots, they've some of the lovely things like the triandrus hybrids, which are bunch flowered and very sweetly scented. Cyclaminius daffodils with the petals swept back and the trumpet pushed out.
I think Cyclaminius must be my favourite. I love Cyclaminius.
Jetfire.
I've had Jetfire out in my garden, only a little patch of Jetfire, and that's so early and it's lovely, like little orange trumpet, reflex yellow petals. It's so cheerful, and it is. I mean, the other great thing about, well, I'm sure my other bulb catalogues do it, but to mark them as early to mid, late, so that you know, is this going to be an early flower or a late flower? Get your full season of interest from your Narcissus bulbs.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? So you buy an early flowering one. The one we've got that is the earliest in our garden is Rijnveld's Early Sensation, which is just a golden daffodil.
Yeah.
And I have to say I was rather prejudiced against it because I just thought I've had it in the garden and it's still here in various places. And then Ian said to me he'd been to one of the RHS gardens somewhere, and he said that it was just so refreshing to see a host of golden daffodils. And I think that is the key, you see. If you see enough of them. And so we've planted them in the winter garden because they flower so early. Now, ours didn't flower until probably middle of February this year, but in the garden here, the ones that I planted many years ago, they would flower as early as the beginning of January. So I think the earliest we've had a proper flower open, the buds come up, turn, and then they open. The earliest they've actually opened fully is on January the 6th. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago. So, but, to start the season with something like that, and then if you look at what you like throughout the catalogue, it doesn't matter what it is, but early to mid to late, so on and so forth. And the latest of all is, of course, is the most wonderful pheasant eye narcissus, the one that's highly scented, that doesn't flower until May. And if you're terribly clever and you've grown Tulipa sprengeri, which I know you've got some seedlings of, Tulipa sprengeri, you can combine it with the pheasant eye narcissi, and they have narcissi and tulips into June.
Have I spoken about this on the podcast yet? I can't remember because we've spoken about it, off air.
Well, I don't think you have. No.
My goodness!
Come on, spill the beans.
You should have been in my garden. I don't know. I think the neighbours thought I'd won the lottery. I don't get that much time to be in my garden, to be honest. Because if you've had a baby, you'll know how it is. If the baby sleeps, you undoubtedly have loads of laundry or whatever, or podcast editing to do. So I don't actually get to spend much time in my garden. If I do garden, it's normally at the allotment because I've walked there and the baby's fallen asleep. And I'm there and I might be able to do some weeding or something. So my poor garden is so neglected. But I think the in-laws, the outlaws were round. We're not married, but And so there was an abundance of people to give attention to the child and the dog. And so I was just having a little perusal of things that I hadn't seen happening in the garden. And I have this tray that's just been sitting there because I was pretty much 95% sure that the tulips I'd sown in it were gone, dead, perished, dried out or something. And I thought, hang on, hold ye hard, as we'd say in Norfolk. Hold ye hard. You can see little leaves. And then right on top of the soil, there was a tiny little tulip bulb that I just picked up and I held in my hand with this.
And I've got the picture to prove it.
Extreme state of wonder. And sure enough, covering this tray, which I've treated very badly because some other things seeded into it that I dug out, little Achilles and things had seeded in. So I prized them out, sure that everything else was dead. Some little tulip leaves. And they're probably this is probably their third season after I sowed them. It was seed that I bought at Beth Chatto's garden that had been collected from Tulipa sprengeri at Beth Chatto's garden. So I feel, excited about the provenance and the fact that it reminds me of this wonderful trip to Beth Chatto's garden. But I cannot believe that they're actually alive. So I think they might be big enough that later in the season I could possibly put them in something like a long tom so they don't do this blasted escaping thing at the bottom of the pot, which I'm now very worried about, which I've heard they do. But I cannot believe it. And I was basically almost running around my small garden going, everyone thought I was mad. No one understood. So I had to send Alan a picture because I was so excited.
I understand completely because I've done it myself. And what I'm going to do in future with my sprengeri here, I mean, I've got some, but I haven't got acres and acres of them, which would be lovely to have. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sow the seed in long toms. In actual fact, you mentioned long toms because the tulip bulbs, occasionally they will put a drop of bulb down. And you know, that will go right to the bottom. And if you plant them in the soil, quite often this is what they do because they find their own level that way. Because tulip bulbs, they need a certain amount of baking, I think, to make them flower again. And the ones that are highly bred in the garden, I mean, you know, sometimes they will last for several years, and sometimes you'll never see them again, or you'll just see a leaf or two, and then there'll be no flowers because they're so highly bred and they're pumped full of everything else to make them saleable and flower in their first year. So I always think that the species tulips, in actual fact, if you look at them, they are absolutely lovely, and their bulbs are much smaller. I think sometimes people look at species tulip bulbs and they think they've got something as big as a snowdrop bulb. Well, that's no good, but it is, because that's naturally how they grow. I mean, I remember seeing with you, Thordis, a tulip. I think it was tulip orphanidea, something or other. Orphanidea Flava?
No, orphanidea Flava, yes. Because this was the one that when we were recording the Richard Hobbs podcast, we were recording a podcast, we mentioned the Richard Hobbs podcast. We couldn't remember the name. Now, I did manage to put the video up on the video version, so you saw what it was. But if you were listening to the audio version of the podcast, you'd be left wondering what was this tulip that we couldn't remember the name of. And it was orphanidea Flava.
Well, I went to York Gate early spring. Well, I suppose it was mid-spring because this tulip was flowering. And I looked at it and I said, "Where did you get that?" And they told me where they got it from. And it was a kind of very obscure site or seller. And I can't even remember who it was now, but I did actually order 100 bulbs, and they were quite expensive. But I mean, I thought this is the thing you've got to do. And we've got them in the garden this year for the first time. So hopefully they will become established and they will become a regular contributor to the spring scene without having to replant tulips every year.
That's exciting. They're very pretty. Just describe again for anyone who missed the previous episode where you were getting enthused.
Well, they're quite fairly tall. I suppose they're nearly 45 centimeters tall, 30 to 45, a foot to 18 inches tall, not quite 18 inches probably. The foliage is smaller than you'd get on a hybrid tulip, but the flowers, which are again a little bit smaller, they are the most wonderful shade of orange, but they have this olive green streaking on the outsides of the petals. And then, of course, when they open fully in the sun, as tulips do, it's like a bright orange sunshine, or cutting an orange in half, looking at you know. And it is that wonderful thing. And I think if you go through the bulb list when you're looking and choosing bulbs, do have a look at the species tulips, because I think in some ways, I mean, the big tulips are lovely, but you know, you do get tired of these sort of things that look like boiled eggs on sticks.
Now, even Alan doesn't know this, but behind the scenes, I am working on potentially quite an exciting Talking Dirty episode about species tulips. So we'll have to see. It's in the works. We'll see if that comes to fruition. Fingers crossed it will at some point soon. And also, I'll do again in the video version. I'll link to Alan's tulip seed sowing video, which has been so popular and hopefully has helped people the world over get sowing tulips on our Get Gardening YouTube channel. And maybe also the follow-up video where we catch up with those bulbs, you know, a couple of years, 3 years on, or however long it is, to see how they've gone from seed to bulb.
I was actually just going to say, when we were talking about sowing Tulipa sprengeri, I'm going to sow them in long toms, and I leave them in those long toms for at least 2 years after germination, and then I'm going to tip them out and plant the whole pot. So I'm not going to necessarily disturb the bulbs, but I would leave them until they're finished their growing season, which is probably sometime in late July, August or something like that, and then tip them out and just plant the whole pot. Hopefully they will have enough roots to hold the root ball together. And therefore once they're in the ground, you're away.
Now, because I was a numpty when I sowed my seed, I did it in a quite not a shallow tray, but a standard tray.
That's how I did mine in the video.
There we go. I'm not a numpty then. I was just I was taking your
We're
lead.
good numpties together, maybe.
But when I come to do mine, I was just gonna sort of try and just get all the bulbs out. Can I then just plant them up several bulbs into a long tom? Is that what you'd recommend?
When I did mine in the seed tray, I waited until they completely died down and everything else, and then I'm searching through this compost very diligently. I mean, I actually had a sieve, a garden riddle, a sieve, and I sieved the soil gently, and that's how I extracted all the bulbs to make sure that I didn't miss any.
Yeah, I think that's what I will end up doing. Going back to other bulbs, going back to the Scamps catalogue, we will link to the Scamps video we did. Wonderful, going through all the different divisions and explaining them all. But there were a couple that caught my eye while I was waiting for us to record. Loving cyclaminius daffodils as I did, and I've already extolled the virtues of beryl, who I adore. Turncoat, I couldn't find a lot of information about, but it looks ever so pretty. I do love an orange trumpet. So it's got a very short little orange trumpet and the standard reflex petals of a cyclaminius. Though actually underneath it in the catalogue's one called Firstborn, which perhaps I should get considering my recent endeavours with my child. But the Poeticus, what it took me a very long time to realise when I got into gardening was I just thought there is a pheasant-side daffodil. There is a pheasant-side narcissus. I never realised for years that there are so many subtly different gorgeous pheasant-side narcissi with just slightly different sized trumpets, and some have more orange edging or more green in the centre, and something like Actaea, which is a pre-1919 sort of pheasant-side, is absolutely gorgeous, and in AGM as well. And they are pricey, these bulbs we're mentioning. This isn't your kind of tete-a-tete go and get 100 million for £5. But I think it's well worth it, and you can put them in.
You should also just mention that in AGM it's an award of garden merit that's given by the Plant Trials Committee at the Royal Horticultural Society. So if a plant has an award of garden merit, it does mean that it has performed well in their trials. Talking of which, as a partnership. Segue. As a partnership garden, East Ruston Old Vicarage is taking part in a trial of Hedychiums, hardy gingers, or part of the trial is to see which ones are hardy and which ones are not. And the general consensus of opinion is that they are hardier than people think. Or is it our climate changing? I mean, who knows? It's a little bit one, a little bit the other, probably. But we're doing a trial of gingers, and I think we're probably going to have in excess of 90 different varieties. And some of them are very similar, of course. So, visitors to the garden here can go and look at the trials and see what they like, or, which ones they prefer and all the rest of it. And it will be interesting to compare them as garden plants, as foliage plants, as flowering plants. And also the other thing that is judged is their gardenability. I mean, whether people can use them. Do they give enough value for money, or do they just put up 3 flowers and it's dead within a week? And and is there anything left to carry on? All sorts of things are judged, and scent, of course, as well with Hedychium's gingers, because some of them are swooningly scented, which is lovely. So that's an interesting thing, and they are thought of in terms of a garden plant as being more permanent plants than they used to be in our gardens. Not every garden, if you live in a frost pocket, it wouldn't probably work for you. But I mean, most gardeners today, with a little bit of, if they're prepared to, not mollycoddle them, I wouldn't say, but to give them a little bit of attention. For instance, if you give them a 2 or 3 inch covering over their crowns in the winter of compost or some kind of mulch to ward off Jack Frost and his ministrations, you probably stand a greater chance of it carrying on. And I'll tell you one of the interesting things about gingers. I've got a plant, a big clump in the exotic garden, which I haven't touched for years. And it's interesting in the fact that this is, what is it? Hedychium, I think it might be Tara, the one named after Tony Schilling's daughter, with orange flowers, big spikes, a lovely foliage plant. It looks, to all intents and purposes, like a big canna coming up. But where the clump has grown, it's gradually got bare in the middle and all around the outside. So it makes rhizomes that sit on almost on the surface of the soil. And then the new ones are all on the outside. So it's gradually spreading out. And it's quite fascinating to look at that, just to see it. I mean, even in the winter when there's no foliage there, just to see that structure of the way the plant grows is absolutely fascinating. Which reminds me, I must divide that plant. Let me make it.
These conversations serve so many purposes. Aid memoirs for Alan as much as everything
memoir,
else.
yeah.
Now, Flomo-wise, sitting here with this catalogue, I mean, I've got quite a lot of it now. It did also, looking through this, remind me of there are a couple of varieties you've grown, which are not necessarily narcissi that I would naturally be drawn to. And I wouldn't necessarily see them in here and think, oh, I must grow that. And yet, in your garden in particular, and growing as pot specimens, actually, one thing I did want to say is reading this catalogue and some little notes. Adrian had written that the cyclaminias, he likes to grow them in pots, but it's best to plant them in the garden the following year. And that's probably true of quite a lot of these. Have them as a pot specimen, maybe for a year or two, but, think about moving them on so that the bulbs get the chance to get some more nutrients and room to develop.
I would cancel that and say that Adrian is right. In actual fact, we need to do it just for 1 year only.
Yeah.
And then put them in the garden, because then, however diligent we are, you've got, especially with some of the dwarf narcissus, they're in pots, and I mean they need feeding, they need attention until their foliage dies down, and then they get largely forgotten and all the rest of it. But there's nothing else you can do for them after the foliage has died down. But the thing is, they do need attention and they need feeding, and sometimes they don't get it if they're in a pot.
Yeah.
So get them in the garden after the first year, having them in a pot.
But you've had some fantastic ones at East Ruston in years past. One of them was Articol, which, I mean, split corona, not something that I would necessarily go for normally. But I'm just trying to find it in looking at.
Oh yes, I can see it. It's on page 25.
And yes, there it is. I mean, I don't think that photo quite does it justice, really. In real life, the sort of roughly split corona was really quite arresting.
Well, I think, you see, lots of these I've probably seen somewhere and made a note of. And that's why I probably picked that one, because I don't think I'd necessarily pick it from the picture, because I'm looking at something that looks like frilly petticoats, which doesn't appeal to me whatsoever.
But in real life, it's wonderful. A bit like, I mean, nothing like to look at, but similarly, Rataplan, it does look fetching in its photo in this catalogue. But in real life, it is just such a robust, unusual looking. I mean, it's in the miscellaneous group, so it doesn't quite fit into any of the normal divisions of daffodils, and it looks like it doesn't quite fit in to any of the normal divisions.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think this is what people like, gardeners like, isn't it? I mean, you look at Rataplan, it's got slightly reflexed petals, but they don't just go sweeping back; they're kind of curved back in a sort of a almost as if I'm sort of trying to expose myself kind of way. And then if you look at the trumpet is actually divided. And so you've got that zigzag, zigzag.
It's the zigzag,
and the trumpet,
right? Yeah, it's that kind of jaunty. It's jaunty. That's what it is.
Yes. And the trumpet is actually a golden or an orange trumpet with a golden edge to it. Take your time and look at them, and look at some of these plants in close up. Really, I'm trying to say, I think, and also, take a look back to some of the what we call heritage varieties.
Oh, yeah.
And they're the forerunners of the big hybrids that we grow today. And around us here in our part of Norfolk, quite often you're driving along the roadsides and you will see, and probably more so towards the fens as well, you will see clumps of daffodils on the field verges and things. And they are crops of yesteryear that were in those fields. And quite often they're rather nice in the fact that they're slightly more, this is what I mean, historical or heritage varieties. They're slightly looser, they're slightly more elegant, they haven't got the brashness, the fullness, the loudness, the shoutiness of all the modern hybrids. And to my mind, they sort of suit the garden better than perhaps some of the others which should be consigned to the cut flower market, maybe.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion. I mean, don't take my word for it by any means. But some of the yep.
Have a look at some of those heritage varieties, because they've got their own magical, subtle charm.
Mrs
So,
Langtry, for
yes,
instance.
she's lovely. Lovely, delicate, thin petals.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And just nice. Mm.
That was not planned, FLOMO, by the way. FLOMO being that fear of missing out you get about a flower or a plant. That was the FLOMO that came from me just sitting here looking at the catalogue before we recorded. I was already FLOMOing for another Tropaeolum, but a more standard one to the Valborn podcast, where I was getting excited about Hercarianum, a species one. You know how I'd grown a pack of Tropaeolum seed last year on the
Yep.
allotment, and I've got a lovely salmony one. Obviously, did not collect the seed because I was not organised. So anyway, I saw a Tropaeolum called Gleam Salmon on the Chiltern seed list, and it looks gorgeous, lovely salmony flowers. So I think I might have to put another seed order in and get myself some salmony nasturtiums. I know that's not a very exciting FLOMO, but it's my FLOMO nonetheless.
Well, no, it is in a way, because, you know, you talk about, I mean, the one thing that I would say is that quite often you talk about saving nasturtium seeds. Well, you'll get a hodgepodge of colours and everything else. You can't guarantee what you're going to get. And I wouldn't have known this unless I'd grown some of the old varieties which have double flowers, because the double flowered nasturtiums, we call them that name rather than Tropaeolum majus, nasturtiums are sterile. And so you have to propagate them vegetatively with cuttings. And so I suddenly thought, well, if I get you know how you sow or you get a nasturtium that pops up and it's suddenly a colour that you don't see. That we had one in the garden here that was kind of olivey rusty colour. It was a very strange colour. And so I grew it from cuttings, and so I kept it going for several years. I haven't got it now because I became lackluster about it and didn't carry on with it, I suppose. But yeah, if you've got a particular variety that you like colour-wise, and you want to, and you think to yourself, well, I'd like to have more of this next year, well, take some cuttings, keep them in a pot, frost-free over the winter if you can, and then take another set of cuttings in the following March or April, and then you'll have some lovely young plants to start you off in the garden for the following year. Yeah. That's the way to do it, and to keep the colour going through. I remember once going to Plantsman's Preference, Tim Fuller's nursery, and it was very late in the year, and I suppose we'd had several very cold nights, and he had a nasturtium growing in a pot, and it was kind of pink, cream and green, and any flower that's got green on it I find alluring. I mean, I don't know, I mean, green is my favorite color, but there's enough greenery around without having it on flowers, you might say. But there's something about a green flower that is very alluring. And I said, could I take some cuttings? And he said, yeah, help yourself. So I took 2 or 3 cuttings and I grew it. And of course, when it came into flower the following year, it was just a pink. And what had caused this coloration is the cold nights and the short nights, and it forced it into this kind of chameleon-like stage, I suppose, where it's not really what it wants to be, but what it is caused by the climate and the shortage of daylight. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Thinking of nasturtiums has also made me think of sweet peas. Because I suppose when I've taken nasturtium cuttings, it's a bit like when I had my Ken Aslet that wasn't a Ken Aslet. I nipped it out because it was outgrowing the space, and I used the bits I nipped out as my cuttings. And of course, you can do the same thing with sweet peas. So you can nip them out and then create more sweet peas by using those as cuttings. And that reminded me that this isn't a FLOMO as such as a sort of plant structure FOMO. Dear friend of mine, Charlotte Gurney, runs White House Farm in just outside Norwich, not very far from Alan, lives not very far from Alan, actually. And she had seen and shared with me on Instagram a sweet pea wigwam that was essentially created as a child's teepee. So it had a hole out one sort of quarter of it so that the children could get in and have a little den surrounded by all these sweet pea flowers. And I thought he's probably a bit young for it, but how wonderful would that be in a future year to create a sort of hideout for your kiddywinks or your grandchildren that's festooned in flower. They probably get stung by a bee or something, but hey.
I saw something similar where somebody had made a caterpillar in their garden, and they'd made it out of willow, And of course, willow, you stick it in the ground, it roots, and they'd woven it around the top and all the rest of it. And I thought, this is all very well, but you're going to rue the day in 5 years' time when the stems of that willow get so big, you've got a tree there to get rid of almost, because I'm sure you're not going to want it forever, and it won't last forever anyway.
Oh.
But it's great fun. You can do lovely things for children like that.
That sounds lovely. Now, I've been very greedy with my Flomo. What would you like to add to the Flomo conversation?
Well, funnily enough, good old-fashioned lilac. Years ago, we did plant quite a lot of lilac in the garden, and there are one or two remaining plants of it. But a few years ago, I planted a yellow-flowered lilac. Well, forget that. It's not really yellow. I mean, think pale primrose, if you like, and you're more than likely to get it right. So pale primrose lilac I've got, and I have a hankering to get one called Princess Sturza. And Princess Sturza was a very famous gardener. She was a Polish lady, and she married a Romanian prince, I think, and came to live in northern France. And like lots of good lady gardeners, she was a bossy old thing. And if you went to her garden and you didn't have a pair of Wellington boots to put on to walk around with, she almost told you not to bother. But she had several plants named after her. One of them is a lilac. And I was going through my Richard came the other day from Lincolnshire and brought me some plants down. And I was just going through the list, and there is a pot of Princess Sturza lilac. And so I think I probably got that as a I don't know, present. He does things like that, Richard. He slips you little things in, Thought you might like to try this. There'll be a note in the pot,
How very generous. And if you'd like to hear more about Princess Sturza,
two ways for this, because he knows that I've got it, and he knows where there is a source of material to propagate it from. So we're scratching backs in a way.
And if you'd like to hear more about Princess Sturza, of course, she was a huge influence on John Massey, and he talked about her in the Hepatica special. So that was just a couple of episodes back. Hopefully you've seen it, but if not, the comments we got on it were just like, what a lovely man, what an inspiration, what a great plants person. He is a joy to spend any time with, and of course, a wonderful, wonderful grower and breeder of plants.
Well, I did mention a quote to that from that video with Richard the other day when I saw him, and I said, John Massey started really with hellebores and cyclamen coum and early flowering plants to try and keep his nursery going and to keep his staff employed throughout the dark months, the winter months. And it's so important that, not just to have the business, but the business actually supports a population. It supports people. Yeah. And it's very nice to be able to do that.
And then brings us lots of joy, feeds the early pollinators, just keeps on giving. Alan, this has been a joy as ever. Of course, your garden is open Wednesday to Sunday now. Also, we should say before we wind up that shortly after this goes out into the world, we will be, hopefully, unless something suddenly awful happens, reunited on the airwaves, because as of the first weekend in April, we will be back on the radio together. Haven't been on the radio together for years now, but fingers crossed. Available on FM if you are listening in Norfolk, Suffolk and Cambridgeshire in the UK, but also available on BBC Sounds on the app. On a Sunday morning from about 11, we're going to be talking plants. There'll be a bit of music thrown in there. There'll be a bit of this and that, but we will be able to get together with some great gardening minds and answer people's questions and just share in the great love of all things planty.
And Ian Roof is going to join us too, isn't he? Our friend Ian, he's going to be there, and he's a lovely man. So, if you want to, do think of getting your questions ready. And I don't know, can people phone in, Thordis? I guess they can.
They'll be able to phone in on the day. You can contact me on Instagram at Thunder Fairy. We'll have an email address that you can use as well. I'm not quite sure post-maternity leave, all of that is up and running at the moment. But we'll work on it. And and we'll be able to answer questions and just generally have a really good gardening chat every Sunday from 11. So it's not just a one-off. We're reunited on Sunday the 7th, but Alan will be along most weeks, and there'll be a host of other wonderful gardening people. Barbara Seagal, who's been on this podcast, who's based in Suffolk. Hopefully, Joe Sharman, of course, of Monk Silver, who's based just down the road from me in Cambridgeshire. Steve Coghill, head gardener at King's College. All kinds of people from East Anglia coming and joining the fun and games and sharing their top plants at the moment and giving you some brilliant tips as well. Can't wait.
We may
tell.
even revive the tip of the week. Who knows?
We may. Anyway, there'll be more on that in the coming weeks, I'm sure. But until next time, have a wonderful spring and happy gardening.
Happy gardening, everybody. Lovely to see you.
No, same again for this. I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Oh.
Right, working?
Now, you've frozen, so I'm assuming that's something to do with the connection, is it?
Hello?
Talking.
I don't even know.
Moving and everything. I mean, this is so exciting.
This is a new venture for us. We've actually got a connection that works.
Connection. Actually, you've reminded me. I need to blow my nose, don't I? Because otherwise I'm going to regret it if I don't.